In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. Today, we get truly grimdark and learn how to make our minis nasty, gritty, and grimy. Grimdark is the quintessential term used to describe the universe of Warhammer, and was popularized by this very game. Funny enough, Games Workshop doesn't actually paint their minis in a quote-unquote grimdark style. Their paint schemes tend to be very crisp and clean, and that's kind of been known as the heavy metal style up to this point. So it's kind of funny to think that grimdark is considered to be such a important aspect of Warhammer 40k, but in reality the paint schemes that Games Workshop puts out there aren't really representative of that. So let's talk a little bit today about how we can make paint jobs a little bit more representative of the core of Warhammer 40k. Really, an important aspect of painting grimdark miniatures is just extreme and heavy weathering effects. Weathering is a great way to add depth and character to any miniature and kind of give it that little higher aspect of realism and grittiness that just makes it stand out. But when we're painting in this grimdark style, it tends to take it to the nth degree. We're turning the dial to 11 here. We're going to take weathering to the extremes here on this miniature. Now, painting in grimdark starts like any other paint job. We want to make sure to lay down a great foundation of opaque base coats and do some minor highlighting. Just because we're going to do a lot of weathering and a lot of desaturation and grittiness on the miniature, we still want to have a great foundation for it to build off of. And I like to make sure that all my base coats are extremely opaque. I don't want any type of foundation paints showing through. I want all my layers to be very opaque, and I like to do maybe 1 to 2 layers of highlights just to help drive home those contrast points. Another key aspect of the grimdark style, in addition to heavy weathering, is desaturation. We don't really want a lot of super bright tones or highlights or anything like that. Overall, we want the miniature to be somewhat desaturated. This is all about looking gritty and grimy and dark. We want things to look like they have been through hell and back. So we don't want a lot of pristine, opaque, bright colors. Now, I would highly recommend the use of true metallic metals here. You definitely can use NMM at a later stage if that's something you're interested in doing. But when utilizing a lot of heavy weathering techniques, I think true metallic metals tend to stand out really well, and they benefit a lot from this washing and weathering effects that we're going to be utilizing. It makes them look really good, and they really add a lot of depth in the miniature when you add all these weathering techniques to true metallic metal paints. So let's really get into the thick of it here. Let's really dive into the techniques and the products we're going to be utilizing to achieve this grimdark look here. So now that you have laid the foundation of a super opaque base coat and a couple layers of highlights, we're now going to talk about the specific tools and products to create this griminess and this heavy weathered effect. So the first product we're going to make use of is, of course, oil paints. Now, for some, this may not be that weird, and for others, it could be really weird. We tend to primarily use acrylic paints when it comes to painting miniatures, but oil paints have some cool properties that we can take advantage of that can add some cool effects and some weathering effects. The main kind of key point to an oil paint is that it has a very, very long drying time. So this gives us a long time to work with it and manipulate it, as well kind of alter the application of it. I like to get a cheap plastic kind of dry palette to mix my oil paints on. So what I like to do is take my oil paint, squeeze a little bit out into one of the little spots, and then you're going to take odorless thinner, and you're going to kind of pipette this into your oil paint that you've squeezed out, and you want to break it down to kind of a wash consistency, so very, very watery. And then once you've got it to this consistency, you're going to take a cheap crappy brush and you're going to lather the part of the miniature you want. In this case, I'm utilizing oil washes for the skin and kind of gunmetal metallics. So now that we have lathered the part of the miniature we want in our oil paints, we're going to move to the most important step, and that is to wait. Yeah, that's right, I said wait. I like to wait anywhere between 6 and 8 minutes, And all this does is that it's going to let the paint start to ever so slightly dry and kind of stain that area of the miniature a little bit. So we want to wait the 6 to 8 minutes just so that when in our next step, we don't just remove all of the paint. So once we have awaited our allotted time of 6 to 8 minutes, we get to kind of make our first use of the unique property of oil paints. So because oil paints have such a long drying time, we can actually take some of the paint away at this point. So we want it to function like a wash. We want it to be, dark in our recesses, lighter on the edges. So since we've covered the whole miniature in the paint, the entire miniature is covered in paint. And this helps give it overall stain effect. But we want to take a Q-tip and we're going to put this in our odorless thinner and then make sure to kind of dab it off in a paper towel. You don't want it soaking. I make that mistake a little bit here and having a little bit too much on my Q-tip, but all is well. And you're just going to lightly dab and swipe at the highest edges to remove the oil paint. And so all this does is that it keeps it dark in the recesses and lighter on the raised edges, and so we can get that contrast effect like we want. I want to stress how important it is to very lightly blot and swipe. If you're too aggressive with this, you can remove some acrylic paints. It's not a huge risk, but I do end up taking a little bit out just because I'm a little aggressive with it. But something to keep in mind, just be very gentle with it. So when we use more traditional acrylic washes, we tend to, lather the part of the miniature we want washed, and then we build our acrylic paints back up on top of it. So instead of adding more paint with acrylic washes, when we're using oil washes, we're actually removing some of the oil paint to get that contrast effect yet. So it's just a different method. It offers a slightly different result, and you tend to get a little bit of more of a grittier, darker, and more desaturated tone with these oil washes, and they can add a really cool effect and add that depth very quickly and easily. So we're not done with oil paints yet. We're going to come back to them for another effect a little bit later, but for our next product, and this is pretty quintessential and I think one of the most popular kind of grimdark tools in the handbag, and it is AK's Streaking Grime. Now, Streaking Grime is actually an enamel product, but it functions very similar to a wash, but it's based in enamel paints. So we're going to use it in a pretty similar way in how we used our oil paints. Technically, Streaking Grime is marketed as the little kind of, rust and wear marks from like vents and stuff like that. But in this case, we're actually going to lather a part of the miniature entirely in this stuff to kind of give it a brown, rusty tone. So one thing that is nice about the Streaking Grime is you don't have to do any thinning. It is good to go out of the bottle. I do like to pipette it out of the bottle and not just dip my brush into it, as you can get some little pieces of debris and stuff in there, and we don't really want that. So I usually pipette a little bit of the Streaking Grime out into my little plastic palette I have so that I can utilize it. And it doesn't require any thinning, so super nice. So just like the oil paint, you just want to lather the desired area in the paint. And we are going to, again, wait 6 to 8 minutes once we have properly covered the area we want. And this time around, we're going to use a Q-tip again, but instead of utilizing odorless thinner, we're going to use isopropyl alcohol. Now, a lot of places recommend 99%, but I use 91% because I have a ton of it that I use for 3D printing, and it worked just as well. So if you have 99% or 91%, it'll probably work all the same. So same type of process. We're going to take a Q-tip, dip it in there, dot it off in our paper towels. We don't want it, soaked. And we're going to kind of do the same exact thing where we're going to blot and swipe away at the area we want to remove the paint. And in this case, I focused mainly on the kind of gold brass banding and left the black area untouched to kind of leave it with that brown rusty tone. So as you can see, the Mini has a great desaturated tone. It has a lot of depth in it. It looks very gritty and grimy. And at this point, if you wanted to stop, you totally could. But we're actually going to utilize a couple more effects. But, the blessing of enamel and oil paints is also a curse, and then in the long drying time. And so we want to let this bad boy sit for at least 12 to 24 hours. That's kind of my go-to wait time, and let the oil paints dry before we do any more work on it. Because if we try to work on it now, our acrylic paints will mess or mix with the oil paints that are still drying, and we don't want that. So I think when we're painting Grimdark, it can be very tempting to stick to blacks and browns as far as our oil and enamel washes go, but I encourage you to get creative with some colors. I think that you can definitely utilize some oranges and reds to get some other really cool red effects. Another effect that I want to touch on is utilizing turquoise to maybe try and create an oxidizing rust kind of effect. And so, I just encourage you to get creative like I am with this. So let's jump into this next technique of utilizing oil paints in a more specific way. So I wanted this Mauler Fiend to look old and gritty, like he'd been through a lot of battles. And so in order to kind of help drive home that effect, I thought it would be cool to put turquoise along the metal banding to kind of create this oxidizing rusted metal effect. I don't know if that really totally makes sense in the realism fact, but I think it does add to the overall look of the miniature and adds another level of grit and story to the miniature that I really like. So instead of lathering an entire area in my oil wash, I'm focusing my turquoise wash just to the banding area. And then I'm going to go back in with the odorless thinner on a Q-tip and just wipe away on the raised edges and leave that turquoise in the recesses to kind of, where water would have built up and the rust would have been occurring the most. So once again, I just encourage you to get creative with all the different colors out there and don't just stick to just browns and blacks because it can be very tempting. The next effect I want to touch on to drive home our gritty, nasty, grimy boy is blood and gore. So this is obviously a giant murder robot beast, and I think he would have some nastiness on him. So I want him to, look like he's recently, murdered some space marines or something. An effect I did on my Balrog miniature was on the axe, and I think this is a great base kind of layer when it comes to, utilizing and doing blood effects. And so all I do is I take Sigvold Burgundy contrast paint and I just put this in the recesses of where my blood effect is going to start. So I did this in a lot of the flesh and metal areas to kind of look like it's fused together unnaturally and, just make it look that much more grimy and gritty. So that's a really easy blood effect if you want to just kind of have that, dried old blood kind of in the corners of something. Just Sigvold Burgundy contrast paint has done me wonders. Yoo-hoo glue is a clear adhesive, but we're not going to use it to adhere anything. No, we're actually going to utilize this glue for kind of its unique stringy quality, and this stringiness actually stays once it dries, so you can create these really cool slimy sticky saliva effects around the mouth. And that's exactly what I did at the kind of little metallic tongue he has sticking out. I kind of strung it back and forth between the tongue and his mouth. Side note for doing slimy saliva effects, I actually really like to utilize gloss varnish. I have this little bottle of it from Vallejo, and I just take one of my crappy brushes and I will just paint it onto the gums and teeth of whatever monster I'm doing my saliva effect on, and that just helps drive home the kind of wet dripping saliva effect if his whole mouth just looks wet. So gloss varnish, super quick and easy way to create a wet looking surface. But we can utilize some other products to kind of create a sticky, bloody gore effect, and I like to utilize my Sigvold Burgundy and then the Blood for the Blood Cod effect paint, and I usually just mix a little bit of this together with some Yoo-hoo glue. Now you have to be kind of quick because this kind of congeals into just nothingness after a little bit, so once you have it mixed you need to kind of immediately go and put it on your miniature. But this can give this great sticky, sinewy, gory mess effect, and I put this around his left claw that he kind of has lifted up to kind of look like he's just recently torn the guts out of something or a bunch of someone's. You can utilize just a toothpick. I utilize these little plastic spatulas and just something that you don't mind getting ruined. I wouldn't use a paintbrush or anything like that because the glue is just going to immediately destroy it. So make sure it's something you don't care too much about and use it quick because the fast drying time will catch up on you. And all you have to do is just kind of weave it and string it back and forth, make sure it catches the edges, and it will dry in whatever shape you have it set in. So I've never really painted a miniature like this before. I've kind of always followed a more traditional method of, base coats, wash, highlights, or just building up a bunch of acrylic layers to create contrast. So, utilizing oil paints and enamel paints and all these other different types of products to create all this depth and contrast in miniature is, totally new to me, but I found it really cool. It just creates such a unique miniature. Like, none of the other miniatures on my shelf look like this, and so it just creates such a unique effect and really captures that desaturated, gritty tone that you think of when you hear the word grimdark. So without further ado, let's see this bad boy and show him off. If you like this video and you like this painting style, let me know. There are definitely more effects and techniques and products that can be utilized to create this dark, gritty effect. And if you want me to show off some of those and show how they work and how to do them, let me know. I'd love to make that video. There's definitely a lot of other cool things we can do to create these heavily weathered, gritty, grimdark bad boys. As always, subscribe to the channel, like the video, it all super helps me out. We're growing steadily and slowly, and it's all thanks to you guys. If you like this video, you can check out my Balrog video. I cover some other similar effects to create some gritty nastiness. Also, check out all the links down below. You can hit up my Discord and show off what you're painting, and we can discuss some cool paint jobs and discuss just, have some mini painting fun. It's a good time in there. So I appreciate it all. And of course, as always, elevate your game night.